There's a person in front of me, they're like a mystery somehow. Maybe I know their gender, assume 100 things about them. Relating is like being ready to be wrong about everything you would assume about them, because now you're going to actually get to know.
Hello, dear listener, and welcome to Strolling. In this extended episode, I'm speaking with Jessica Alonso, who's currently a personal development coach after many years of working in tech as a programmer, mentor, and manager. I've known her mostly online for some years through group discussions in the inter-intellect community, and in each conversation I always heard her say at least one thing that I've carried with me until today. I've internalized many of those ideas and feel like they've improved and expanded my life with greater capacity to be there for others as well as for myself. Emotions are invisible or tricky for many people, and the language of therapy can seem foreign or sound like empty platitudes. The way Jessica describes how to navigate these spaces is so down to earth, yet powerful when it helps you recognize what's going on within and around you. I feel confident in saying you'll come away with something transformational from our conversation, and I hope you'll pass it on. Our world needs it. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Normally I would just do a welcome thing, but in your case I felt like I should say welcome to the first volume in a series of 300 with Jessica Alonso or something like this, but just because I feel like we have so much we could talk about, and you also feel like there's a lot to talk about or that we can talk about, so glad you're here. And
I'm glad you're here.
I'm also glad I'm here. And it's wonderful actually to have this hang with you and Tristan and spend time together and talk about all kinds of things, and I feel like we're always strolling anyway. So this is just a way to do it for make benefit of others people. Why do you feel like you have so much to talk about?
Gosh, I think that a lot of the stuff that I'm interested in, and have been thinking about for a long time, is sort of necessarily connected to everything somehow. Like having landed down in human development land very early, it's a very rich foundation that connects to all sorts of stuff. There's very few topics that people talk about that it doesn't somehow start to immediately connect and start overlapping with other stuff. Actually,
could you just define what human development means?
What human development means?
For someone who maybe has not heard that term.
Sure. So human development, it's how do we become what we become?
Yeah.
Gosh, it's huge because it's not just in the lifespan of one person either. It's kind of your connectedness to the infinite cause and effect into the past and into the future.
Okay.
So it's interdisciplinary. There's no part of science or social science or concept that isn't somehow at play.
So it's different from self-help, or self-help is a part of it, but it's there's another.
Self-help feels related in that an individual can at sometimes think, hey, there's something going on in my development or in my life that needs to be different, and then takes kind of a conscious approach to trying to root out maybe an issue or wants to grow in a specific way. But all of this also happens completely unconsciously too. So self-help is this is also just how does a baby learn to walk, right? How does a zygote become a fetus? It's from that. It's also just evolution at its core. Every process is an evolutionary one in this kind of way of thinking. It's not even a field so much as a way of thinking that everything things just fold into really beautifully. And it's complex but simple and infinite and observable. It's wild.
Yeah, you said essentially it becomes tied to everything. I've heard you use this phrase before, that everything is relational.
Yeah.
So in some sense, you're always tapping into this kind of, you can think of it as the same topic or the same subject because it comes up and has implications everywhere, and Do you think like, I don't know, do you think people know that that's a thing?
Sometimes I think people do. There's a thing I've noticed talking to certain friends where I realize, oh, this person thinks developmentally, but they do it in like their sphere, right? So I had a friend I was talking with like maybe a month or two ago who was talking about like the evolution of like language and terms in this like very developmental way of like a thing is not just created, like a change is introduced into a context that already exists, and then it dances with that context and evolves from there to like become the meaning that we make out of it. And I was like listening, and there's a way there when you think that way, you can kind of reverse engineer things in a certain way. Like, oh, if this word means this in the general parlance, it was probably introduced this way into this context and kind of became that. You know, you can kind of like track how change occurs in this way. And I
now
was,
you're talking about language.
Yeah, she was talking about language.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, that's like a very developmental way of thinking about how does a word come to mean to people what it comes to mean. It's not like things are just invented and like defined and then packaged and it's like now we all use that word that way. Right. There's an organic evolution that occurs. And that's part of the relationality, right? It's like a thing, it's not just a thing, it's a thing in an evolutionary context that then morphs and like molds in that context.
Yeah. I feel like we're currently just talking about like 7 different things, and
yes.
I would love to just take a crack and go somewhere. I'm not really sure where, but I would maybe ask you like what's kind of, in all of your experience in exploring this, I'll call it a topic of human development, like what do you think is like, if you had to pick like the most kind of powerful concept or something that you think about often or something that is kind of visible everywhere that perhaps we don't think about enough?
I think the most like the thing that rings out as very self-evident to me all the time when people talk about anything is that everything came from somewhere. That there's no like, oh, that pattern or that approach or that attitude or that behavior, oh, that just like spawned for no reason or something. That if you see a pattern,
or also like it's always been this way.
Well, it's always well, it's always been changing, but there was like nothing came from nothing. So there was always something that was like where it started, and since then change has been occurring from a starting point. So for example, people will have behavioral patterns as like a 30-year-old that are the evolved form of a pattern that might have started when they were in utero, and then when they were an infant, and then when they were a 3-year-old, and then when they were a 10-year-old. Like it undergoes these evolutions in these different contexts. And now when you're 30, it's like those early things, including like the ancestral environment you came from, of course, like the family context you were born into, those became the scaffolds, like the template that you start from, and then you exist and you live and you interact, and it just kind of builds from there and evolves from there. And so when somebody says, oh, I started doing that when I was 18, like the first time I remember that happening when it was 18 was when I was 18, there's usually something there, but there's usually some other like more primitive or simpler form of the same dynamic earlier and earlier.
Comes from somewhere.
It comes from somewhere, right? Everything comes from somewhere. But it hasn't always been the same. But there's echoes of it, right? It's like the bones. You can kind of see the foundational scaffolding structure based off of what grew out of it.
How does that inform you in the way that you approach things?
I think I almost like reflexively find that path, almost like immediately when it's me looking at my own stuff. That kind of path down to like where that comes from, that doesn't take much time now to unfold. I can kind of just like, oh, yep, okay, there it goes.
This is describing...
This is like if I'm looking at a pattern of mine.
Okay.
Right? It's like, okay, what did this look like 10 years ago? What was like the nascent form of like this thing?
Okay. So you observe yourself doing something repeatedly or just at certain intervals, and then you're trying to figure out how did this start, or like what it was like a long time ago, and how did it develop into the current form, and what you might like to do with that, or...
That, I would say that at different points in my life where I was, especially let's say in the past like 5 years, where I was like working more on like my stuff, that's like the form it took. Now it's more that this kind of just happens like automatically. I recognize it's like it's actually a way of like seeing.
Okay.
And then it's just like, oh, okay, that came from that, which is weird to talk about. I don't know if I've ever talked about it.
Maybe perhaps you don't want to be so specific.
Well, it's hard to explain in a certain way.
It's abstract. It's a bit abstract.
One thing I think that grants is like, first there's a sense of like continuity. Like there's almost a neutrality to seeing like the way I like behave through that like lens, because it's like, oh, of course I'm doing this thing because that grew from here, which grew from here, and there are points in there where I know I was young enough to not have had choices in what I was doing.
Okay.
Right? Like I didn't choose to like set up the scaffolds that way. So it grants a little bit of like holding lightly with like neutrality of like, yeah, this would have grown from that. So I don't get too caught up in like the kind of self-shamey, self-blamey, like, you should have known better, you should have done better, like what's wrong with, that's one thing that I find is it grants a sort of like softness to that, I guess, examination. Yeah, I think that's one thing. Like there's a certain way that, sure, as like humans, we have like more conscious awareness of what's going on with ourselves, but at the same time, we are just organic like beings who are growing in an evolutionary context. I do have certain things where I'm like, oh, that was dumb, but it was more just like, oh, that was a dumb like moment sort of thing.
Yeah, I feel like when you articulate these things, it's kind of lighthearted and playful.
Yeah.
Even if you're not happy about something, it's like, oh, like,
yeah.
And it's like, it's a bit, it's interesting because other people, and I would say myself included, like can feel overwhelmed by the emotion that we're feeling, or just like, I say sometimes attachment to a specific outcome about whatever the situation was. And it's like, of course you're human and you probably have some of those things, but it seems like you avoid like getting stuck in this kind of dark space where you're just like frustrated or angry, or I don't know. What's the secret?
Well, okay, so angry is like you have to actually let it happen. You can't not want to be angry. If you're angry, you're angry. Like, like part of it is I actually don't resist those things. Okay. I'm pretty comfortable with the fact that sometimes I get pissed off, and
you allow yourself to be pissed off. Yeah.
It's like, yeah, well, even there's a thing where I think there's allowing yourself to be pissed off is actually a stop. It's like stop doing the other thing, where you stop yourself from being pissed off, or right. It's like
it shouldn't need to be allowed. It should just flow.
It's actually that the not allowing is an extra step people are doing, and often that's like I've found an external like thing that was learned usually pretty young, that you shouldn't feel that way. Like at some point somebody got mad and they immediately, in the like swell of anger, pushed a kid or yelled or did something just from that angry place, and somebody responded with like a harshness toward them, and then the harshness, like, especially when we're young, we can't like differentiate between having felt the anger and having pushed the kid or having yelled at the person, and then that the harshness of response that we get might have just been about our outward like violence or expression. It comes inside and like yells at us about the fact that that feeling came up.
It's like we've been trained, or we've internalized that we should not feel that way, and we're scolding ourselves.
Yeah.
Because other people may have scolded us, or because we've gotten a message that it's not okay.
Whether it came through harshness or just like even very subtle things, because we're super sensitive when we're that young. It's like you learn, if that thing comes up, I'm going to find myself alone. So that thing, it can't be here. And so that's one of the like main things that I do with, you know, people I work with myself in general, which I do think the seeds of that for me started when I was like working with children in my like college like education, lab practicum, like preschool work type stuff. Is like, just let it be here. Like, let the thing happen. Like, what happens then? Or at least like you can do that here. Like, we can let it happen. And none of it actually means to stick around. Like, that thing just came in to do its thing, and then it's gonna go.
I've heard you say this also, that when you allow yourself to feel an emotion, it doesn't stay there forever. It tends to just come in and then it passes or something like that. And actually, if something does feel like it's sticking around, it's a sign of...
So, well, there's a couple reasons why that thing doesn't happen. So sometimes we actually can't. Like, it would exceed our capacity. It would overwhelm us to really let that wave like hit. And mostly that's kind of where we get all of these like little behaviors. They can be really subtle. They can be like in our thoughts, or they can be behavioral. They could be picking up the phone or something. We do all these things to bail on the process, or to avoid that process from happening. It's really about when we have space for the wave to come, for it to actually to like build, because usually they like expand a bit in their size and crest and like complete, and that's actually like a physiological process that happens. That this isn't to say that what people should be doing is just letting themselves get swamped all the time.
Right.
Like there's a brilliance and an adaptive quality to everything we do to not do this. It really felt necessary. It really was necessary when we were really little.
To not allow ourselves
do that.
To feel...
When we had to make a choice between letting ourselves feel the thing or stay in connection with our caregivers, stay in connection with your caregivers wins every time, for good reason.
Right.
But the issue with that is that means that we didn't spend those young years growing the muscle of like letting the small waves hit, and having someone, literally the caregiver, help us. And there's a way that when you are with somebody who has good capacity and is like has good flow with that the waves can come, that just by being together that you can like borrow from their spaciousness. And that's actually what babies are doing with like their caregivers, is that they are having huge feelings about like gas in their stomach or something. Their bodies don't know how to deal with that. They literally don't have the musculature to like burp on their own. So they need somebody who notices, oh, what this baby needs is to burp, so I'm gonna hold them the right way and help that happen. And they also just need like a heart rate and a breath rate and a muscle tension, holding, touching, to inform their body what calm looks like and how to get back there.
So you're trying to say that there's a reason why we don't allow ourselves, or there's a reason why we have reflexes to not allow ourselves to feel things.
Right.
And I've actually been thinking about that recently. I have this idea, I feel like I don't feel any issue to cry or to feel sad or to show that to other people. I just want to choose when I do it. Or like I feel like I want to be able to put it in a box and say like, I want to just wait until maybe I'm at home and then I'm going to just have my moment alone or with somebody else or whatever. But like, I don't want to just have something overwhelm me whenever it's around or something like that. So I don't know if you think that's the same thing that you're talking about, which is like the reflex to.
That's super different, but it's skillful. So there can be a place where you have enough capacity and the like in the moment feeling is not so big that you can ride the wave almost like in half a second and be informed by the sadness and let some degree of it here, but maybe it's not gonna be kind of such a big reaction.
It's not going to dominate your experience.
That you feel like it's unsafe to be this way around this person or something.
Okay.
But the difference between, oh look, I'm sad. All right, sadness, I see you. We're gonna have a minute about this later, and then I'm gonna cry. I'm gonna hear it out, and you can notice that can actually, the feeling will almost give you space. Be like, okay, you've got it.
Because you saw it.
Because you saw it, and because it sounds like, have a history of actually coming back to it.
Okay.
There's actually a trusting relationship thing there.
Yeah.
Because if you just do that all the time and you never come back to it, that's just going to start leaking out sideways.
Right.
And you're going to just be like contorting in there, and it's like it's actually still like knocking on you. And it's like, no, I'm like I always think of this as like inner child type stuff. It's like sitting there tugging on your wrist, being like, hey, no, I'm really sad right now. And you're like, no, I'm having a conversation. We're good. And it's like, no, you're not. But if you can imagine this scene of like inner child, inner adult who's trying to have this conversation, and the child tugs on the wrist and is like, that made me really sad. And you're like, you know, buddy, like, I hear you. We're gonna talk about that later. Yeah. And he knows.
Let's get some ice cream later and we'll talk about it.
Yeah, you know what? You're gonna sit on my lap. I'm gonna read you a book, and you're gonna tell me everything about how sad that was.
Okay, I take that. I realize I have some idea in my head that like it's about wanting to, I don't know if like be strong is the word, or just feel like I don't break down or I don't hold the space, but like it's like, imagine that like regardless of what's happening, I'm able to just keep going somehow, and I will deal with whatever I'm feeling later, but like so that I can support other people or so that I can support myself to like get to the next step. Like it's this kind of, I don't know if it's survival or something, but there's some picture that I have, regardless of what's happening, regardless of how intense it might make me feel, I need to be able to put it in a box and deal with it on my terms when I want to.
Yep.
What do you think that's healthy in any way, or is that like kind of risky, or?
It doesn't strike me as default unhealthy. The like curiosities that came up to me were how can both be there? How can you invite like a little bit more of like, rather than I need to be like this, otherwise I'm like not functional, or I'm not like serving my role, or people are going to be upset with me. But like, what if you start being like just a little bit, letting, you don't have to take down the barriers and just let it all out in the present, but can some of that come in and be welcome, and give yourself like chances to disprove the belief or the notion that you're like non-functional or not lovable or not doing your part, if you are doing your part while sad, doing your part while frustrated.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Feeling the emotion doesn't make you dysfunctional.
Yeah, and except that sometimes it does, right?
Sometimes it does.
If it swamps you, then it becomes dysfunctional, and it is totally sensible not to want to be that in high stress situations or with people who don't feel like safe people, right? Yeah. Like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. But you can notice sometimes there's this thing just got shut down and it needed to get shut down, and you can have like there's no cause for berating yourself about that. There's no perfection here. Nobody's going to come give you like a gold star for like never ever repressing something, right?
Right.
But you can also notice sometimes you're like, oh, interesting, right there, I got frustrated or I got sad, and it felt like my repression of it was purely habitual. It was like reflexive. It was like, I just did that because that's how I do it. But if I look around, I'm actually around people who I feel like I could say this to. And then it's like, and then there's that moment of like noticing that, oh, it's almost like, oh wait, this other move is available to me in this moment. I just don't usually do it. And so like anytime you're gonna like try something new, there's like a leap of faith moment to be like, guys, I just gotta say, and it's like, and it's weird. But there's a little leap of faith, but it gives your whole body a chance to like have what I've heard called like a disconfirming experience. That if your like habitual experience comes from this like place of when I just let that feeling come through, something bad happens. Now we don't let that feeling come through because we're predicting that it's always going to be like that. But if you give yourself chances to say, well, is that still true? Is that true even here, even right now?
Do I have experience to back that up? Have I tried it?
Have I tried it recently?
Recently?
Was that, and the thing I want to like, I always find myself wanting to point out to people is that our early experiences of this, how your parents or caregivers or siblings or just the adults around you, how they responded to your feelings, that was not like a once a week thing. That was like practice, tens to maybe 100 times a day, every day, while you were young, while you were had like really high neuroplasticity and were really forming the bounds of this. So to say that your like dominant experience was that if I got overwhelmed in this precise way, my mom would get overwhelmed and she wouldn't be able to take care of me anymore, or I'd be left alone, or just people would respond in some way that was a threat to me. Like, you practiced that. Like the repression was so practiced. And so now we're saying sometimes you'll find yourself in a situation where you can be like, okay, usually I do this, but for some reason I feel like this other thing is available and I'm just going to try it once. And now you have like one occurrence.
Because you feel safe around those people.
Yeah. And to me, the difference there, because you kind of don't know if it's safe until you do it, but there's a vibe of like, oh, that time that I didn't speak up, or that time that I was like dishonest or something, that just felt like out of habit. Like that didn't feel like I needed, like I didn't feel like the fear, or I didn't feel it didn't feel quite so necessary. It just felt like what I'm used to.
Yeah.
And I did it anyway. And then you can be like, okay, so here goes nothing. Let me roll the dice and try something new and see what happens.
You call yourself a bubbly person, and yet you have this thing about grief. Like you said, you met somebody who's also like bubbly and grief. Like, is that connected somehow? Or
yeah, deeply.
Why?
Deeply connected. Okay, so, gosh, where do you even begin on this? So there's this one way that I put this these days, and there's a lot to it, but that your capacity for grief is actually your capacity for love. They're the same. And that's just something I've like stumbled upon in my own like experience, that like you can't love something more than you have the capacity to grieve its loss. Like that's the risk of love, is that that thing will someday not be there to like receive your love. And actually that's another thing I say about grief, is that grief is like, to me, what grief feels like is it's the feeling of like the thwarted expression of love. It's like, I have all this love in here and now it has nowhere to go. I can't express it. It can't be received anymore. So like that person is gone, that relationship is gone, or like that person, our relationship has changed such that it is no longer like appropriate for me to express the love I still hold for them to them directly. And so do you have a...
I was just going to say, so that's grief.
To me, that's what grief feels like. Like, to me, that's where grief arises.
Yeah. How did you say it again? It's
The thwarted expression of love.
no, the other thing.
That the capacity for grief
Can,
is the same as the capacity for love.
Yeah, I'm trying to let that one sink in.
Yeah. Well, let me say it this way. I was talking with a friend about like abandonment, like worries, you know, like you're like dating someone and you're scared that they're not going to like you, that it's not going to turn out this way. That basically it's like you have this hope in you for that. You almost have already started dreaming about like this future relationship that you'll have with this person, all the love you're going to have together, all this possibility, right? And there's this like fear that it won't get to happen, basically. And so that to me feels like, okay, you've got this like love brewing in there and you're really scared that it's not going to get to become expressed. It's not going to get to be real. And so there's all this stuff you could go into there about abandonment stuff, but that's not the point right now. The point what to me was like, yeah, you have all this love in here and you're scared you're not going to get to see it through. Okay, what if that doesn't happen, right? What if you start dating this person and they love you back just that much and you have the most perfect relationship that has ever happened and you stay together the rest of your whole lives and now one of you passes away? Oh shit. Like, you know, the same thing. Like, is that actually less scary in terms of the amount of grief you'll feel over the amount of love you experienced, right? Like this little nascent bit of love that you're hoping to become real. Like there's no version of love that doesn't carry its like other side.
So it's inevitable.
It's inevitable because we're mortal. And also, to me, so this is where it becomes less just about like breakups or loss or death. I think this is true about every kind of change, constantly. That if you are to like love your life as it is, that means that when your life changes, even if you end up loving what it changes into, you've lost something.
And you might still grieve that.
If you've lost it, I think there's like grief and bittersweetness to every transition. If you, to the degree that you love the way things were, I think that there is grief to growing up. I think there's grief to your kids growing up. I think there's grief to your best friend growing into herself. Because now, you know, you could be so happy for her. It's just that it's not only grief. You can also feel more love, happiness, joy. It's just that the grief is also there.
Yeah.
And if we don't like ever let that, this is like hugely repressed. And if we can't ever feel that, it gets like all clogged up inside. And at some point it feels like people start resisting change and start resisting love. Because it's like they get all stuck with it. It's taking up space.
Yeah. And so how do you grieve your friend coming into herself? How do you let that out? Or what would you say is a conducive way to deal with that?
So my like current working like theory is like first an expression of grief, which is grief is like a wave. It comes. There's usually crying. You know, I might need to be held, just held while I sob or something like that. That's like classic grief presentation. But sometimes to like get it moving, like because sometimes it's like stopped. It's like held back. To get it moving, what I'm playing with now is this idea that what you need to do to get it moving is to let that love get expressed, right? Like, what is it that you loved about the way things were?
And you would say that to yourself or to someone who can hold the space with you?
Yeah, it's like, so there's like, grief is like the painful part of the like stoppedness, but that means there's always something under here of some sort of like love of like that person or that circumstance or the way things were, that I'm like sad about it not being that way anymore. And sometimes I think that actually, so it looks like naming it, feeling it, letting it. At this point, I also don't have like a lot of the resistance to grief. I'm like, oh, here it is. Like, let me cry, you know? And then, but there's a feeling to me. So this is like on the other side of the grief wave, right? So the beginning of the grief wave, I find for a lot of people, it feels like tension like here or behind the eyes or in the throat or like heaviness in the chest. But that's like the holding back part. Like that's the avoiding the part of letting it come up and letting it go. And so if you can let it come up, and there's probably sobbing or crying or some sort of expression, there might be all sorts of stuff under there. You could get mad at some point. Like it's all part of it.
Yeah.
But on the other side of it, I always feel that there's like this big, like energetic, expansive, vivid, like very alive feeling of expansiveness that comes on the other side of any wave of grief. That it's like these days to me it feels like the nature of these two things of like grief and love, like their relationship to each other, or also like death and like creation, like it becomes like obvious that the relationship between those things somehow, it becomes just like, oh, there it is, there's the spaciousness that was just created for more love.
How does this tie to being bubbly?
Because to me, bubbliness is like just, I'll like just love what's going on.
So bubbliness is love.
I guess. I think when I say bubbly, I think it's from the outside. I think people would look and be like, you're a bubbly person.
Exactly.
And it's like, no, I actually just am really happy about everything that's going on.
Yeah.
And there's a way that like, there's somehow where that there's a relationship to that and the willingness to let things go too.
Okay, so maybe I'll rephrase that. So how does being happy about everything that's going on tie to grief? And perhaps I would interpret it's like, oh, well, you can appreciate things. You appreciate everything, or you appreciate feelings that you have, even if they're not pleasant, or even if it provokes some kind of reaction in you that's not pleasant. Like I don't know, that's how I would interpret it, but I could let you.
So to me, it's about I mean, there's something here where it has a lot to do with presence. That you can, if you are okay, or if to the degree that you can grieve things like ending or things changing, the less grasping to like the way things are in a specific configuration there is, and the more kind of just like in this moment, which might be very different from the last moment. Like sometimes I mean, a conversation will die, and you can tell that sometimes somebody like really didn't want that conversation to die, and then they keep trying to like bring it back to life. And there's something about like when you're doing that, which is fine. Like people do that because they really did like that conversation. They really wanted that vibe to continue the way it was. But they also are then not leaving space for the next one to come. You know, they're not like kind of free and open to catch the next wave, because they're really like looking back and they're like, no, I liked that one. Right. You know?
Okay. Shall we talk about shall we?
Sure. Did I bring this up to you?
I heard it on another podcast. I was so fascinated with that when I heard it.
Okay.
And I'm trying to think about that everywhere now, and it's something I feel like that's changed my life, just to think about that. So I would love if you'd tell that.
Okay.
In your way.
Yeah. So this is about like two people, like that everything's like a bid. Like, shall we talk about this?
Yeah.
Shall we joke with each other this way?
Yeah.
Shall we, be like this? Shall we go there?
Yeah. I love it because it just applies to everything. Like you can think about this in terms of exploring boundaries, or like deciding what to eat, or like, what shall we talk about, or like it's just anytime you're doing something with another person or with other people, like it's like a whole spectrum of possibilities where you can say this, and it's so short. Also, it's just shall we, and it's like, and it brings this. It feels like it makes it so easy to just try and get together on the same page, or have the intention to get together on the same page, and Yeah, like, did you invent that? Did you get it from somewhere?
So I would say that, because we must have talked about that like in 2021 or whatever. I think that has like evolved to a different
Catch me up.
way I talk about it, but it's very still true. So I talk a lot about like your yes and your no. So if we talk individually for a second, at any given time, there's what's in my yes. I'm going to say my yes space.
Okay.
And then there's what's no to me. So you could be like, oh, let's talk about this. And it's no for me or something, right? But when you say, let's talk about shall we? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, yeah, let's talk about that.
That's in your yes
So that's
space.
in my yes space, right?
Yeah.
And so what shall we is doing is trying to find our shared yes space, like the overlapping yes space, because I like to live in yes space, and I like for other people to get to live in yes space too.
In their version of it.
In their yes space, yeah. I mean, and I just think like my yes space tends to be like pretty big as it. So going back to your first question of why I feel like I have a lot to talk about is actually I think mostly I really enjoy and I'm pretty good at finding shared yes space.
Oh, cool.
So I think I can
I
have
see
a
that.
pretty good conversation with most people because we're gonna find something, and then sometimes it actually doesn't happen.
Okay. Okay. Now I'm going to tie that to another question later on.
Okay.
But keep going.
But so to me, boundaries are about your no space. Actually, that your boundary is kind of the line between these things,
Yeah.
right? And so to me, a boundary, when I talk about boundaries, what I'm not talking about is when you did this, I didn't like that, and so now I need you to be different, right? What to me boundaries are about is actually your awareness of your no space and your commitment to not living in it. Like that, oh, if no matter, like if this person's behavior or whatever is really trying to keep me in a space that is no for me, and that I'm not about letting that happen. I want to go live in yes. So I'm out. You know, or
it's about you taking the responsibility to, well, maybe responsibility is a heavy word, but to have the awareness to keep yourself in your own yes space and perhaps not accept if someone's continually trying to bring you in a no space or...
Yeah, I mean, well, there's sort of a way where outside of like actual violence and like real intense coercion, it's actually not up to somebody else if I'm going to be in no. Like, unless they're going to grab me and like physically restrain me, I always have an option to like go. At the very least, I can just straight up walk out.
Yeah.
I can also ask for change, but if the change doesn't happen, and it's like responsibility is a good word, but what it comes down to is I actually don't want to be anywhere but my yes space. Like, you know, I think there's something here about not wanting something else more than I want to be in yes.
Yeah. Would you say you live most of your life in your yes space? In the last year, let's say, for example?
I do think that most of my time is spent in my yes space, but I also think that I'm probably living in like a smaller portion of it than I could.
Okay.
I think there's like a lot more
Right.
that I haven't experienced that I'm like not necessarily...
It's true for most people.
Yeah, and so I kind of want to like explore more of it. But yeah, I think at this point I don't spend a lot of time doing things I don't want to be doing.
Genius.
I mean, but
Why is that hard?
oh, for so many reasons.
So many reasons, yes. But
Well, but one of the first things is sometimes people actually can't sense it. People don't necessarily, like, sometimes it's a thing I do to sometimes help somebody start to sense that you have a way of knowing what you want and don't want in the moment that isn't thinking about it. And it's a sensing thing. Like, it's like, oh, this is yes for me right now, and that doesn't mean I'm committing to it to always be yes, but for whatever reason, right now, that's yes. It's not policy. It's
Right.
not commitment.
Right.
It's attunement to like this moment. What's yes
It's
right now?
awareness of yourself and how you're feeling
Yes.
in a given moment, and learning how to understand how you're feeling in general. And that perhaps could be like a policy, maybe, but like, no.
No, you can't. I mean, I would say that when I first started like practicing that, like usually choosing to make a practice of something is sort of setting yourself some scaffolding. It's like, I'm going to, like, past me is going to impose this upon future me for a time to see what happens. And in like being like, oh, I'm gonna use my discernment more than this, I'm going to try to check into that before I kind of do habitual things. That was a policy for a time. But then in doing that, I grew into what it's like to live from that place. And then it's not, I don't need a policy for it because I don't want to do something else. You know, it's like the perpetual yes of like, so here's what I also will say about that is that, so like things like being overwhelmed, being overly tired, like being kind of over your capacity I've found makes it really hard to sense that. Like, so I think of that, of having connectedness to the yes and no, like that's your compass. It tells you how to navigate. And sometimes that sense gets like muted. It can be muted because you don't have the capacity to feel these things. You don't have the capacity to be with like the consequence of it, right? Because sometimes like what's your yes and what's your no is not always going to be easy on you.
Yeah.
Right? It can cause a lot of trouble. And so sometimes there's these things that kind of suppress even that sense. But then there's things like you might find that certain relationships or certain settings dull that sense, right? Like, oh, when I'm around this person, it makes it hard for me to hear myself for whatever reason. And one of the like more policy-like things I have is that if I'm in a space where that sense is getting muted, that's not where I'm supposed to be.
And
like,
you just leave?
Somehow, if it's like energetically I need to duck out or I need to like get some space or something, like that I don't actually want to navigate without my compass.
Okay. So this is useful in sort of the negative way of like, I need to know how to not interrupt my ability to use my compass and navigate. And maybe in the positive way, like how do I, what are some ways that you think people can see how they're feeling or get more close to that? Because sometimes it's not obvious how to do that.
Yep. Yeah. So where I like tell people to start is actually in like the small decisions of life. Like you don't want to be like, oh, I'm trying to build up the strength of my like compass, and so now I'm going to decide whether or not to quit my job. Right? That's like a big thing.
Right.
But maybe it's like standing in front of your closet and you have 3 shirts in front of you that are all technically fine with what the weather is. And do you feel drawn to one? Do you have a way of choosing between those 3 shirts that isn't thinking about it? Do you know right now whether or not you would want a drink of water? Like, do you know right now if you would want a bite of an apple? Like, do you know right now if you would want to stand up and do jumping jacks? Like, there's a way where you could think about it like, well, jumping jacks would do this, Just yes or no, first thing. From somewhere other than the manager or the weighing.
Without thinking about it.
Yeah. Can you find that you actually have this? Another fun version of this is going on a walk, and one where it's not totally planned. Maybe you have like a time limit or something, but you walk out to the corner, and standing there on the corner, you try to sense which way your body wants to go. Straight, right, left. And
simple decisions.
Yeah, it's just right now. It's not that you're saying this is always the way to go, or like it's not outcome related. It's actually can I like move with whatever seems like it wants to happen right now without knowing where it's trying to take me or why that's the thing. I just feel drawn that way. What happens when I go there?
Great. You were at my salon on building social bridges, where it was about trying to figure out how to talk to people who maybe have differing political views than you. And I mean, you said something here that I probably could bring up, but I was actually just thinking about that now when you were talking about the yes space, where you said you can easily have a conversation with almost anybody because you can quickly find the yes space, or their yes space, and therefore, I think this is something powerful. Like the way I have always thought about it is, in terms of relating to people that have different beliefs than you or different politics than you, you don't have to agree with them, and sometimes it might even be painful to hear about their way of doing things or how they see things or whatever, and so you shouldn't suffer, but just try and figure out like what are the things maybe you can, what are the connection points that where it feels like it can be conducive, and like you've shortened that to like the yes space, which I find fascinating. And like, what is it in this respect of like the kind of building social bridges sense? Like, do you think about that consciously, of finding the yes space with somebody that thinks very differently than you, or is it just like you just do that with whoever's around and you're not trying to?
Yeah, it doesn't feel like a conscious effort. It's more like when somebody is expressing themselves, they are kind of expressing, well, sometimes somebody is really expressing their no. Sometimes people are very like no oriented, and they're talking like, I don't like this, I don't want this, no, no, they're like really living in that, right. Or that's where their attention's going. But I feel like at a not very conscious level, I'm listening for the yes part, like, or I'm listening for what is the shared yes space. Like, I'm kind of just oriented toward it. I honestly can also say I don't really find myself in a lot of conversations with somebody who's like, they're, saying something that would be like, I don't know about deeply offensive, but like that would, basically it's like if something they're saying lights up a bunch of stuff in you that's like a threat response or something, well, we're not playing anymore then, like, and it's mostly like, oh, we're kind of like playing, like I'm just kind of seeing what's here, and if there's anything, I mean, I'll walk up to a conversation and kind of hear what's going on, and they'll all seem to be in a yes space that's like doesn't have that much overlap with me, and that's when I'm like, okay, I'm moving on to find something else. I don't need to like, I'm not trying to like make it.
You don't have to force your way in, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not trying to make it that.
You don't need it, yeah.
Yeah, this is a big part of it, I think. So a lot of people will have an easier time connecting to their no than connecting to their yes. Like that they don't like that. Like that they don't want this, that they don't like that feels bad. They'll just be a little bit more familiar with noticing that. And that's a fine place to start. But people can be very practiced in like getting a little fixated on no and be like, wait, why is that no? Like, can I make that yes? Like, how do I need to be different so that no can be a yes? And it's like, it feels like there's something, it feels like scarcity related sort of thing. Like there's a lot of fixation on why isn't this thing for me? This thing is, people that I admire seem to be into this. Why am I not into that? And then they're like trying to like make the no into a yes. And I find that like the way I live at least is that that's like not what no is for. Like no is to get you to like bounce off it and go find yes. Not to try to like squeeze yes out of a no.
Whoa.
Like it's just like, oh, that's not for me. Off I go to find what is for me.
I guess this is something I've made a sport out of for myself. To like throw myself, well, I don't throw myself into no situations, but just like I out of some kind of necessity, I feel like it's important for myself to do that. Based on how I see things, or it's just like maybe my idea of how to affect change in the world. Like you can have so much division, and one of the reasons for division is because people don't talk to each other, and so I try to create this social bridge so that we can at least like, even if you just say hello to the person, or if it feels superficial somehow, just not have the price of not having that, or feeling like you can't even look that person in the eye, or you can't even ask them a question, is very costly.
Yep.
And ends up having these massive consequences when masses of people are doing it.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
I'm in this like habit of trying to see how far I can go in either my no space, or in some like in a space of disagreement with someone, and seeing how much I can tolerate, or seeing how much I can enjoy even a kind of exchange with this person. And I mean, the way you're talking about it, it makes me feel a bit contorted in how I approach this stuff.
But it sounds like there can be.
It's funny also. I mean, it's like,
I totally know what you're referring to.
Actually? Like,
no, but in a certain way, can I enjoy this? Is actually finding the yesness in it. Right.
There's some yesness for me, maybe.
There's a yesness to going into the challenge.
Right.
And that can be true. I will jokingly like refer to, there's like a no kind of yes and a yes kind of no. Where it's like, I kind of hate this, but I want to stand near it anyway. And it's like, you know, and it's like, I don't get too analytical about that either. You know, I'm like, for whatever, there's a thing where I find that like, I find out why that was a yes when I do it. You know, if I try to stand back and be like, wait, why do I want to like be near this conversation that kind of like irks me in this way? Then I'm like modeling it, I'm trying to predict it, and it's like, but if I'm in it, then I kind of like find it. I find like the groove, like why am I here? Oh, this is like doing something for me.
I will continue to sense myself and see how far I want to go with that. But I just thought it was interesting just in the way that you were saying it.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll bring up something more specific.
Sure.
And also, like, maybe some of these notes are old and you don't really have much to say about it now, but I'll take my chance. So this is sort of a paraphrase of what you said, which I wrote. Divided people may share smaller beliefs, so they might have some things in common. Yep. People with similar conclusions may have surprisingly different values. So people might agree on the same specific thing, but somehow they have other like values that are maybe contradictory. A world where everyone agrees has no room for evolution.
Yep.
So unpack the belief into values and decisions to find common ground. So you, in that way, I think you've just outlined like a bunch of vocabulary to talk about like how people can interface with one another without necessarily having to agree, or sometimes maybe they do agree but they are different. Like, so I find that fascinating, and considering the political climate we are still in today. I mean, this was like 2 years ago, but there's still stuff to be divided about today, and so I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that, or if you think about that, or
so there's something here about having enough like groundedness and comfort in your own being to actually share space with people who disagree without it being so miserable that you have to disengage. Because the things I'm talking about there are what come up if you actually get to talking in more detail about a belief, right? Like if somebody would vote for a policy that says this should happen and somebody else should vote for the policy in the opposite direction, if those two can't even like share space together for long enough to talk about that, then they're never going to find any common ground, right? And sometimes people can't share space with those people for good reason, right? Because it actually like really feels like threat, and it's like, okay, but if you have enough safety like in you and what, you know, and it's that sort of thing where you can like stay in conversation and in like a sort of dialogue with somebody. What I've found is that, and what I had found at that time, because this was a while back, was some surprising cases where people who were all on the same side of an issue, if they got to talking about like how they landed there, like what beliefs and values added up to that conclusion, that there was actually a much wider range of how they got there. Like just beliefs about like how change works, how people are, like what government's for or whatever. Like even in the like agreeing side, there was so much diversity there in where you could even find like a real point of contention between people who are like nominally on the same side. And then on the other side of that if you do the same thing with people who disagree, yeah, sure, sometimes you find somebody who like disagrees on all of these pieces about like how people are, how change happens, what government, you could find big disagreement, but you can also find that sometimes you actually agreed on like 90% of the thing. And then the actual what made the difference between which way you went on that was like this.
And you wouldn't find that out unless you actually
That's right.
talk with the person.
Yeah, because the way it looks is just people who agree and people who disagree. And it turns out that there's like a lot underneath that.
Yeah. Because it's focused on the end result of like which one you would vote, which side you would take, but actually your process for coming to that decision would reveal certain things in common probably.
Yeah, you have to like ask some questions there about okay, so if you believe that that's the thing to do, does that mean that this would be the thing to do? And sometimes it's like, oh, like you start talking through things and you start getting the shape of how they landed where they did. And then you find, oh, actually my shape for how I land, like sometimes it comes down to literally like 2 differences in personal experience. Just of like, oh, I had this side of the experience and you had that side of the experience and now we're like over here. And it can be so small. And then also that I do think there's something about like agreement that doesn't go into depth that also leaves something uncovered about like differences.
So we can agree on things, but we don't.
If you don't talk about them,
without focusing enough on our differences.
Yeah, you can like not
similar.
know that there are differences there, and some of those differences, it turns out, are like big. It's like like, and that's not to say to like sow division, but it can help. I don't know. I think people are more.
Well, then it all feels relative, actually. So the people you agree with might be really different from you, and the people who you disagree with might be really similar to you. And so there's maybe a value to knowing that and seeing that, and therefore they're less they're more similar than they are different.
Yeah. I think that there's this thing I get the sense of sometimes, where I'm like, people are way more different than people assume they are, and people are more similar than there's some weird thing where like the ways we think people are different are kind of like off, and there's the ways we think people are the same that are kind of off. Yeah. And it's
so
both.
It's our assumptions that are kind of miscalibrated, perhaps. Do you have any speculation as to why that might be?
I mean, I think that, well, we do a lot of abstracting, like abstracting about groups of people is just a very different thing from relating with people and like getting to know individuals. Like if you get to know an individual and you have the sort of like relationship where you can speak honestly in depth about how you actually feel about things, how you actually think about things, it's like the entire world of potential difference opens up in front of you just through like individuals. And then some of the things people do when they're abstracting and they're like, oh, all men are like this or all women are like this. It's like, well, no, I can think of 3 women off the top of my head that vary greatly on this thing. And then I can think of 3 men who are more like what you're saying than those 3 women are. And it's like, so all the abstraction part gets kind of fuzzy. It like abstracting is like trying to model based off of like individual traits, which is just very different from like, oh, there's a person in front of me. I actually don't, they're like a mystery somehow. Like maybe I know their gender and I might like assume 100 things about them, but those are all assumptions, and relating is like being ready to be wrong about everything you would assume about them, because now you're going to actually get to know. Our bodies don't know about what's going on in some of the technological spaces of like relating even. Like there's a way that like when I'm reading like tweets or text from somebody I've met before in person, that is actually a very different thing, or that I've like had a video call with. That is actually different from when I read text by somebody who I haven't met that way. Does that make any sense?
Totally. Yeah.
Like I don't have like
You've had more context in
right
to how to interpret
Yeah,
the way.
it's almost like, oh, I can hear it in their voice. I kind of know more what they mean. I can almost like feel like the posture it would come out of. It means more to like my system overall, not my brain. This isn't like the reading, thinking thing. It's more like, oh, that's my friend so-and-so, and they're saying that, and I can like hear it as though they're saying it. But for people who aren't that, I'm either like imagining some like really thin, like not physically thin, but some really narrow
A caricature.
character of them, and well, it's not even and that is always like a projection from me.
Yeah.
And it's more like, oh, I'm kind of just like playing with myself here. Like I'm here, like I'm even reading this thing through the mood that I am currently in, and through the vocal tone I would put on it right then, which means like, because the other side of it's like empty. Like I'm filling it with something from here. And it's just totally different than having like even had that like contact. And more so I'd say that when I think about like kind of what like we need, like as if I was going to like pull back and say, here's what's up with the world and what we're missing and what we need more of, it's all this stuff around like growth and maturation that actually requires, or at least we are built for that stuff to happen in relationship with other people in like physical shared space and in like in embedded context, like in an environment that one person, let's say, sitting by themselves and like pulling in information from other people, like on the internet or something, it's not actually the same thing. Even if that information is coming from someone who's like more mature than they are, it's not the same thing as sharing space and sharing an environmental embedded context with people of different ages, like maturation wise. It's not one dimension. This is across a lot of different dimensions of like growth, but we learn how to embody new ways of being by being around people who already embody those ways of being. We don't embody it by hearing them talk about what it's like to be that way and then hear it through our current way of being and then try to like make it happen. Like we pick up at the very least, it's a very inefficient way to try to make it happen.
If I would rephrase that, it's like, I don't know if I can rephrase that. I want to use this word like feeling the other person in space and seeing how they are and seeing how they inhabit a space and sort of internalizing that.
Yeah, it's not even like a
around.
conscious process. Yeah. It's actually that I think of this as like they hold like the energy of that other way of being. I couldn't say, okay, notice this and notice that and notice that, like in this like discrete, here are what you're looking for sort of ways, but your entire body and being is paying attention to so much more than just what you're consciously noticing. And it's not, now I'm gonna start, I mean, sometimes there's like mimicry that'll be part of like a growth process, is, oh, now I'm kind of just trying to move the way they do. But the actual growth thing is when that way of being comes in and like melds with your you-ness and it like finds your way of doing it. I don't think there's like healthy technological replacements for that, nor do I want there to be.
Yeah.
Like it comes back to that thing about us being organic. You know, that we're not as simple organisms as I think technology treats us as. Like, oh, all you need is these 3 variables to be dialed in. It's like, nope.
Well, I'm happy for you that you feel far away from the tech world.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in some way there's so much to talk about there just because you've had a lot of experience with it and like, especially as someone who's kind of learned to themselves and like found their own way into it. Like, you didn't study it formally, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, but do you feel that there's nothing else you'd want to share about that in terms of like your experiences or your explorations in tech and coming in from the outside? Totally fine also.
When I loved it, I loved it. Like when I loved programming and when I loved building software, I really loved it. It was, I think the industry itself was sometimes like a hard place to be with the like human development background because of the kind of philosophies of oversimplification.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like really overconfident assertion about like what people are and what, you know, so there was a way that experience, or because I worked there for like 12 years, over time what it ended up feeling like to me, the best I can say is it was like the friction of wearing shoes that are too small for you.
Ooh, okay.
Like if you were wearing shoes that were too small for you every day,
Yeah.
it would hurt eventually. Like there's like a cumulative pain to that. It feels like there's something about whether you take things personally or not. Right? Like, which I find that I generally don't.
How?
Okay, well, I think that there is something to like self-awareness, like self-knowledge. Like if you actually know how you feel, if you are not totally blocked off from seeing why you are behaving the way you are or why you feel the way you do, you actually just know more about you than anybody outside of you can. And so it's like, it's not like if somebody tries to say something about me, I just know if they're right or if they're wrong.
It's pretty simple.
You know, and it's like, so there's something where I think like taking things personally in a way that gets really bent out of shape is about like, oh, that person said something right about me that I don't want to be right about me, and now I'm like, you know.
Okay.
But if they're wrong about me, then it's like, okay, and like it doesn't seem like it matters that much necessarily. Like I think there was something that occurred to me like years back that has been pretty helpful at times in a variety of contexts, is that somebody else being wrong about you, either to your face or even just in their own like model of you in their head, you don't have to make that your business necessarily. Like I don't have to set out to like make sure the like neurons firing in everyone's head about Jessica are like totally accurate. It's just like, that's one way I could use my time.
Oh boy.
Like, but then it's like, wait, is it actually important that they're right about me in that way? And that's where it comes in, like, okay, maybe I'm worried that if they are wrong about me in this way, it's going to stop me from being successful in this way. Or there's something
if it doesn't impact you in some way. Then
right. And so some clarity about, well, does it impact me? How does it impact me? Because there's like a sort of image management people can go into that far surpasses that. And then it's like, there's a way where I'm like, I can almost sometimes not think of something less important than whether or not this person thinks that about me.
Okay.
It's just like this one girl over here living her life, that person thinks this about her. Who cares? Like, does that matter at all?
Love
you
it.
know?
Yeah.
And of course, like, then there's the things that do, like, I think it's much more likely to feel hurt by people who are close to me because it does impact me, or it impacts our relationship or something like that. But this, you know, that, I guess another way I'd put it is, I think that the first place I really felt this was like related to gender, was that that being a woman walking around the world and like coming into contact with what people seem to believe about you, like you can feel like the wrongness of it. Like, oh, they assume that women don't enjoy this or aren't good at this. And then they like you can feel those kind of like assumptions come at you. And you're like, well, that's not true about me. Like, I know that that's not true about me. And there's almost a way where I felt this like intractability to the problem of trying to make it all be correct. Like of correcting the thing so that I could be seen like accurately by like anybody who I encounter. And that you could spend a lot of your life and a lot of energy trying to make that be the case.
Oh yeah.
right? Like even like, oh, when I dress this way, people are more likely to assume that I might be like techie or like math oriented or something like that. And it's like, okay, but dressing that way isn't actually just how I want to dress. So now am I dressing this way to try to correct people's perceptions? And by the way, even that doesn't even necessarily guarantee that they're going to be right.
Yeah.
So like, there was a lot to that, but just like having to at some point notice like the wrongness of other people has to be priced in. People are just going to be wrong.
Oh, you have to assume it. Yeah. Okay.
People are just going to be wrong. Like there's no way for people not to be wrong and for me to also just be like expressing myself. And then, okay, so let's take it as a given that people are going to be wrong. Now, how do we want to use our time? Maybe it's like that.
Love it. Anything else you want to share?
Oh, I love everything you pulled in. Again, I didn't know what to expect. And then, but you had collected so many fun, personal, like real things. I'm often talking more about like ideas and theories and less about like me and my relationship to them.
Okay.
So that's really cool for me. That's very
Good.
enjoyable.
Good.
To kind of explore that. Let's see. The thing that I usually like want to sign off with, like in general when I talk to people, is just like encouraging people to take care of themselves. But I feel like with some of the stuff we talked about, there's something more to that about like what I mean by that. And whether it's the feelings, like almost most of what we talked about, like be it what it's like to be around somebody who like holds a different like opinion than you do, what it's like to be around somebody who like misinterprets you the way you are. The thing that drives us to like behave a certain way in response to that is how we feel about it, how it feels to be misinterpreted, how it feels to be around somebody who has that belief. And so what I mean, or at least one way I mean take care of yourself, is to care about what's coming up for you.
To pay attention to how you're
To pay
feeling.
attention to it. That in this house, we care what's going on here for me. And there's a way that when we're not doing that, all these reactions are coming out and like trying to grab someone else and shake them and say, I need you to care about what's going on with me.
Yeah.
Or I need to change you into somebody who cares about how I'm feeling. Or I need to change how this opinion is because I can't deal with the feeling of like them being wrong about me. And so there's this way of like trying to like grab like caring witness out of anywhere that'll give it. So when I say like take care, part of it is you already have like a witness to everything that's going on for you. You might have to practice it, but you can practice it. Like you can turn that over here and you can be the one who cares that made you sad. You can be the one who cares that made you angry. And that feels really important to me because we are so often trying to get that from people who like almost expressly are not going to give it. And to me, what like self-care, like not like self-care industry or something, but like
Caring for yourself.
What caring for yourself means is that like if something made you sad, it isn't actually up to someone else whether or not that gets care. Like if you need something, if you are aware of a need, we get so hung up on like, but this person, I need this person to meet that need. And now I am so hurt that they can't do it. But what if it's not up to them whether you get that need met?
Yeah.
Because you, in caring for yourself, can broaden the field and like look for sources that are like wholesome and like willing and helpful, or you can just source, you have like more available to you than to just like grab that person and demand care from them. Like, hold on, first, have you done this part? Do you know what feeling is driving you to want that from them? Like, do you do the care part?
Yeah, if you put in the effort to see yourself or to witness yourself and what something makes with you, then you would hopefully be in the best position to find some way to deal with it.
Yeah.
And perhaps you may not need something from outside of yourself, or if you did try to do that, you'd have maybe a better idea of what it is that you're looking for, and maybe to be able to articulate it. And so pay attention to yourself, take care of yourself.
Take care of yourself. Like care about what's going on in there. The thing I'd add is that, because this all comes back to those waves, right? That you're in a conversation with somebody who has a different political opinion than you. They say something and whoosh, off we go, right? That's really what we're talking about. That's why you bolt or whatever. And when I say turn toward the feeling, like let it be there, like because you care for it, like the way you would care for somebody who just tripped and fell, the way you would care for a child who needs you. At the beginning of the wave, most of the actions will be about trying to make the wave not happen. They're going to be about stopping it or changing it externally.
Stopping.
Yeah, just so, but if you can care and care for, like, what is that that's happening? Here it goes. Okay, there it is. Yep, that sucked. But okay, now you have so much more choices, because the action, sometimes nothing needs to happen after that. Sometimes all of the reaction was just trying to get witness to the feeling. But sometimes the feeling comes and goes, and now, well, clearly our actions don't need to be about preventing it because it already happened. So now what? It's like, oh, it turns out that lets me know that I don't want this kind of dynamic to be part of the relationship that I'm in. What am I going to do about that? How am I going to like communicate that? What happens if, like, what are the options available to me? And it's just that the options available can be from such a different place other than what do I need to do to avoid what's happening right now. Yeah.
Where can people find out more about you?
On Twitter, I'm at Jessica M. Alonso, Alonso with an S. Jessica Malonzo.
Jessica Malonzo.
On Twitter.
You don't have a website?
I don't have a website. But I'm on Twitter. That's where you'll mostly find me writing about things. That's where my coaching link is.
Great to chat with you, Jessica. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, this was wonderful. Thank you for being here.
That was my extended conversation with Jessica Alonso on strolling. If you enjoyed that, you might like my exchange with Alessandra Mendonça, who also cares about community, building social bridges, and how we relate to one another. Or with Cassie Thornton, who describes the transformational power of care. Or with Julia Hayden, who can help you go deeper in awareness of yourself. Find all this and more at strolling.rosano.ca. That's strolling.rosano.ca. See you next time, and thanks for listening.